Hello everybody, I'm Sniping is Fun, and I want to welcome all you to yet another new video series I'm going to be doing here on YouTube for a given time. The first part of which is going to be within the next week and a half, and this new video series is going to be on the Smash Brothers video game series. And basically, my first part of it will be the roster, but I will be doing other things from it, maybe like levels or moves or something like that. I might get into that, but particularly this entire series is going to start off with the roster, and I might eventually move on to other stuff later on. But what I plan on doing with this is I'm going to be looking back on the first three games: Super Smash Bros. On N64, Melee on the GameCube, and Brawl on the Wii. I'm going to look at the rosters those games had, why the roster size was what it was, and why certain characters were chosen, for what reasons these characters were chosen, looking back on it and trying to find a reason for why certain characters were chosen. And then in the fourth video, I'm going to go into doing a Smash Brothers 4 related video, looking into what characters possibly we could see and possibly have a chance to get into Super Smash Bros. 4, Super Smash Bros. U, Super Smash Bros. Universe, whatever it's called. And that's particularly it. This little part of the video you're seeing right now is just my little introduction to the series, so I can let you guys know what you guys can expect. This video in particular that you're going to be watching right now is going to be on the first Smash Brothers on the N64. And it's going to start right about now. I hope you guys like it. Stay tuned for future videos, and see you guys later. Welcome everybody to my new movie series looking back on the Smash Brothers franchise roster selection. This is going to be the first video in that series where I'm going to be looking back on the first game in the Super Smash Brothers franchise, Super Smash Brothers on the Nintendo 64. I'm going to be looking at the roster, why certain characters were chosen, and why the roster was the size that it was. But before I get on to each individual character and talking about why they were included, I'm going to be talking about where Nintendo was mainly looking at when they were choosing these characters, when they wanted to pick these certain characters for inclusion in the first ever Smash Brothers game. And three systems come to mind on that: the Super Nintendo, the original Game Boy, and the Nintendo 64. Now, the NES had some inclusion in it due to the fact that a lot of characters that were on those three systems originated from the NES, and they continued on to those three systems. So maybe only one of them, or possibly two of them, or all three. But the NES didn't come into play as a direct character inclusion, like a direct place, a direct system to pick characters from. It was just coincidence that a lot of the characters were on that because they were franchises. They were characters from franchises that continued on to future Nintendo systems. But the NES wasn't directly picked. The characters weren't directly picked from it. It was just the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, and original Game Boy. The Super Nintendo and the original Game Boy, because it was the previous generation at the time for Nintendo, and that was where most of it came from. Now, the Nintendo 64 had about 4 years or so at the time, maybe 3 to 4 years at the time when Super Smash Bros., the original one, came out, so they had time to pick from that system. Now, when they pick characters from the roster, they don't usually pick from the current generation system, but due to the fact that Super Smash Bros. Came out so late in the Nintendo 64's lifespan, they were able to pick some stuff from the Nintendo 64, which this doesn't always happen in Smash Brothers games, which you guys will see when I talk about Melee and Brawl, but this one's about the original. So, due to the fact that the original Smash Bros. Came out so late in the Nintendo 64's lifespan, they were able to give some inclusion from that system. And that's the reason why I include that as one of the main consoles, not like for the most part, consoles they picked from to get their roster. Now let's get on to characters. The first character I'm going to talk about, of course, will be Mario. And the main reason why Mario was chosen is because he's the mascot of Nintendo. That's the main reason. He's been with Nintendo since day one, basically when they started making NES. He's their main go-to character for their franchise, and it was not just that, but because the games that were on those three systems that they were able to go from due to the fact that he was there. He was in Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo. He was in Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64. He was in Super Mario Land and Super Mario Land 2 6 gold coins on the Game Boy. There was Super Mario Kart on Super Nintendo, Mario Kart 64 on the Nintendo 64, and of course the sports games like Mario Golf at that time. Not on top of all those games, he still is the mascot, and that was the main reason why they included him from the get-go, because Nintendo knew he was their mascot, and if they did not include him, it would kind of be awkward. So that's the reason, really, why Mario was included. It's that simple, really. The next character we're going to go on to is going to be Link from The Legend of Zelda. He's not as big of a character as, Mario, but he is actually a big, well-known Nintendo character, and is one of their mascots underneath Mario. And a ton of Nintendo fans know of what Link looks like, or the concept of the Link character, and basically that's the reason why he was included. And up until that time, there was a Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, Link's Awakening on the Game Boy, and Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64. And due to the fact that they finally made the jump to 3D with Ocarina of Time about a year before Super Smash Bros., that's the reason why they made him Ocarina of Time Link and Super Smash Bros. Because if there was no Ocarina of Time at that time, they would have pretty much took a Link to the Past Link and made a 3D version of him. But due to the fact that Ocarina of Time was the most recent at the time, they were able to take the Link from that game as their character model for the Super Smash Bros. Game. And like you said, he's mainly included because he's one of the big 3-4 Nintendo characters that Nintendo has from one of their big time franchises. So he was basically a shoo-in to include in the game to begin with. Now we're going to get to Samus. She's a known character as well, not as big as, let's say, Link or Mario, but she is a well-known Nintendo character and is considered one of their top mascots for the Metroid series, because Metroid is one of their top series. And on top of the fact that Super Metroid came out on the Super Nintendo and Metroid 2 came out on the Game Boy, she was included because of those reasons. She did not need a Nintendo 64 rep because of the previous systems, which is where most of the roster selection came from, the Super Nintendo and original Game Boy. It didn't matter if she didn't have a Nintendo 64 game, if Metroid didn't have a Nintendo 64 game, because that's where they were mainly drawn from. And due to the fact that she's such a big character to Nintendo, she was basically a shoo-in to be included from the get-go anyways. For Kirby, he's also one of Nintendo's top mascot, most known characters. And because he had Kirby Superstar on the Super Nintendo and Kirby's Dream Land and Pinball Land on the original Game Boy, he was included. Now, when it comes to Kirby specifically, he is Sakurai's creation, so of course Sakurai was going to go, and even regardless of the fact of how well known Kirby is, how big Kirby is been to Nintendo, and how big of a mascot he is to Nintendo, you could also say that Kirby got in because he's Sakurai's own character and Sakurai played favorites in order to put him in there, but that could be a smaller reason because all the other reasons come into play for why he was included. Those come first and foremost before the fact that he's Sakurai's own character. Fox was included because at that time he was one of the more recent characters for Nintendo. He made his debut on the Super Nintendo, the game Star Fox, and he continued over to the Nintendo 64 with Star Fox 64, and he was one of those up-and-coming, at the time, Nintendo characters. They wanted to include him because they had plans to push Fox after that, and they wanted to get him in there so fans knew about him, so they could keep the games coming, so they can keep doing Star Fox games. And he was basically there because he was one of the newer Nintendo characters at the time, and he made his origins on one of the systems they were actually drawing from, and since his game was quite popular and fans loved it, he was basically a shoo-in to be included in Smash Brothers. When it comes to Yoshi, it doesn't technically count as a Mario character. Yoshi does and does not, but in the games they technically count Yoshi as just a Yoshi character. She does not count technically as a Mario. Like Yoshi's is its own character and its own franchise, will also be in the Mario character. Now, this was at the time when they were picking the characters for the game. It was like a newer Mario character. Yoshi made her debut on Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo as a character you could ride, as like your little companion to ride. And then where Yoshi got the biggest, role at was in Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo, where you actually were able to play as and control Yoshi, carrying around Baby Mario and competing in platforming levels, where Yoshi made its biggest impact and had its biggest role at the time, which obviously was on Super Nintendo, being one of the systems Nintendo was looking at. Yoshi's Story also came out on the Nintendo 64, and there was also Yoshi's Cookies, that puzzle game, on the Game Boy. It was pretty simple that they would include Yoshi because of these reasons. Donkey Kong is also one of the biggest mascots and most popular characters Nintendo has had pretty much since their origins. He's been around since before Mario. When Mario was still considered Jumpman, Donkey Kong was there being Donkey Kong in the arcades and everything at the time. And since he was so popular, that came into play why he was there. But it was also because of his most recent roles at the time. The Donkey Kong Country games, even though he was only included in #1 on the Super Nintendo, there was the Donkey Kong game that was based off the original arcade game and NES game that was included on the Game Boy, and of course he was included in Mario Kart and the side games at the time. Thus, Donkey Kong was a pretty good choice of a character to include in the Smash Bros. Roster from the get-go. Now we're going to get to both Pikachu and Jigglypuff. I'm going to talk about both Pokemon characters at the exact same time. At this time, these characters were basically the most recent characters Nintendo had. It was like the new mascot that became super popular for Nintendo. And Pikachu and Jigglypuff were considered at like the time the most popular Pokemon in Generation 1 because of the anime in the games and whatnot. So those two were kind of shoo-ins. Those two were like the ones that were picked to represent Pokemon at the start. And they were there because of the red and blue and yellow on the original Game Boy. And at the time, Pokemon Stadium 1, I think, came out at like a year before that. So it was because of those representations for why Pokemon was able to make it into the first Smash Brothers and was able to be there, is because of that. Mainly the Game Boy games, the original Generation 1 Game Boy games, but Pokemon Stadium and any other games that popped on the Nintendo 64 at that time came into play as well.